It will be many hours today. John Roberts is at our Washington bureau. John?
Well, Dan, let's first of all speak to the issue of whether there was or there was not a kind of a crash in the Camp David area. I spoke with Secret Service sources just a few minutes ago, Dan, who say that they have no evidence that there was any kind of a crash or an explosion or fire or anything near Camp David in the Catoctin Mountains of Maryland. They say that there was this aircraft that went down in the Pittsburgh area, which is still some distance from Camp David, but there was nothing, at least, probably I would think within a number of miles radius of Camp David, and nothing to suggest that Camp David may have been specifically targeted either. However, they do not know at this point where that aircraft that crashed in Pittsburgh was headed, whether it was indeed headed to Pittsburgh, whether it might have been trying to overfly the northern area of Maryland near Camp David. Perhaps it might have been headed for downtown Washington, D.C. Well, because there, of course, is that other aircraft that crashed into the Pentagon. And there appeared to be, at least from my perspective, Dan, upon arrival at the White House this morning, that when that aircraft went into the Pentagon, what had been a fairly mild state of alarm at the White House suddenly went to an enormously high state of alert. They evacuated the building within 5 minutes, and they cordoned off a number of blocks around the White House, not letting anyone back in. And as well, they evacuated the Vice President and his staff. He is in charge of the Situation Room right now.
His staff aside, Lynn Cheney, his wife, also said to be in the same area as the Vice President. But then a development within the last 45 minutes that I certainly don't want to begin to appear to speculate on. We understand that the congressional leadership this morning, after the attacks were taken,
the Capitol Hill Police, and then they dispersed and were operating out of private offices. News has learned from congressional sources just recently that the leadership of Congress, the congressional leadership, has been gathered together and is being ferried by helicopter individually, not individually, to a location outside of Washington, D.C. Now, of course, the big area that has been designated for Congress to go to in the event of a big national emergency, war, nuclear attack, is Weather Mountain in the western part of Virginia, Dan, but we can't say that that's where they've been taken. President Bush, after leaving Sarasota, Florida today, went to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where he made his first statement after receiving a full briefing of what had taken place in New York and Washington. Here's what the president had to say.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status. And we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested. We'll show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
Strong words from President Bush This afternoon from President Bush at Barksdale Air Force Base, where Air Force One touched down after the president left Sarasota, Florida, where he'd been holding an education event earlier today. Those strong words backed up not too long ago by British Prime Minister Tony Blair.
This barbarism will stand
As their shame for all eternity, speaking of the people who perpetrated this act. He also went on to say, Prime Minister Blair of Britain, this is not between the United States and terrorism, but between the free world and terrorism, and that Britain will stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States. Now, shortly after President Bush made that statement, Air Force One took off from Barksdale Air Force Base, destination unknown, but something curious and unusual happened just prior to Air Force One's departure. The normal, what's called tight pool that follows the president around, usually in the area between 13 and 14 people, was whittled down to 5 people. There were a number of people from the media who were left behind at Barksdale Air Force Base, which may be a suggestion that Air Force One is not headed back for Washington, because there would be no reason to leave those people if indeed it were headed back to Andrews Air Force Base, but that indeed Air Force One may be headed for another location. At this point, the president is being kept under tight wraps. No one is talking about his destination or his whereabouts, though we do understand that the vice president is still in Washington, D.C. But again, to reiterate, a change with the leadership of Congress. They have been gathered together and are being helicoptered, ferried individually out of Washington, D.C. to an undisclosed location. And again, as far as any explosion near Camp David, Dan, the Secret Service saying that they have no information about that. It doesn't appear to have happened. Dan?
Roberts, we know that President Dick Cheney is in charge in the White House Situation Room with able assistance from Condoleezza Rice of the National Security Council. Do you know who is with President Bush? Who would be the expert, if you will, helping President Bush as he is in transit from Florida to Shreveport, Louisiana, and then to wherever else he's going?
Well, Dan, when the president left for this trip to Florida, it really was more of a political and an issues trip. So he took his top advisors. Karl Rove is with him. Karen Hughes is with him, as are many of his top political and issue advisors. General Powell was in South America. He is headed back to Washington. Condoleezza Rice stayed here. I do not know if Stephen Hadley, who is the Deputy National Security Advisor, might have been traveling with the president. But Dan, as it was just a quick overnight to Florida, there's no reason for Mr. Hadley to be there. So it may be that the president does not have one of his senior national security staff with him. There's probably a minor staff member. But certainly, Dan, they are doing everything they possibly can to hustle out to the president all of the expertise that he would need. But certainly, Dan, his closest cadre of advisors have been with him since he left on Monday afternoon.
Our White House correspondent John Roberts in Washington. We go to Scott Pelley in downtown on the tip of Manhattan, where the Twin Towers collapsed. Scott?
Dan, I'm just a block from one of the World Trade Center buildings. There's another large building that's a short distance from where the aircraft impacted. It is burning above me now. There are flames shooting out of several stories of this building. Firefighters have told us there is some concern that the building might collapse because apparently the off face of the building has been blown away. There is towering black smoke, as you've seen from your live cameras, still rising over the tip of Manhattan. I just spoke a moment ago with some firefighters from the 3rd Aviation Battalion out of the Bronx. They told me they got here right after the first airplane impacted. They were getting their tools off their truck when the building began to collapse. They described diving into a subway station and hearing all of the World Trade Center tower falling all around them. Apparently their tools are still buried under the rubble, and one of the firefighters said that if the subway station had not been right there, they would certainly all be dead. They also described from the center of this scene a city police lieutenant who was telling them to be careful to get back, and as he was waving his arms in the air, a piece of debris apparently fell from the World Trade Center building and severely
trying to help the
firefighters stay safe. Dan, I'm at the corner of West Broadway and Murray Street, and it is an unbelievable scene here. There are huge drips of paper. This is all the off paper that was so carefully Fully filed in all the hundreds and hundreds of offices in the World Trade Center. It's now scattered everywhere, drifting around like snow. I've seen letters from law schools. I've seen Christmas cards, all kinds of correspondence from what were all the neat, orderly offices and orderly lives in the World Trade Center now flowing around the street here in Lower Manhattan. And finally, couldn't help but notice for the last several hours, there have been several flights of U.S. Air Force F-15 fighter planes flying overhead. One might presume that they are flying combat air patrol over Manhattan to make sure that no other unauthorized aircraft get anywhere close to here. Flying combat air patrol over the soil of the United States. Dan?
Scott Pelley in Lower Manhattan. Rocky Pasafaro is a chauffeur who was waiting for a client at Way and Chambers here in New York City, about a half mile from the World Trade Center buildings. Mr. Pasafaro, you saw one of the planes do what?
Well, you know, I was outside my car reading the paper, and two women walked by me, and they looked up and they says, "Look at that!" And as soon as I looked up, the plane entered the first building with the antenna, and just blew up in tremendous explosion and paper and everything. And it was just like chaos. And then like 15 minutes later, I see the other plane coming northbound, hit the South Tower, and a big ball of flame. Everything was blown all over the place. It was terrible. I spent a lot of time in Nam, and I've seen a lot of action, and this was scary. I seen people jumping off the buildings. I seen people getting they were out in the streets getting hit by cars. It was just ugly. It was just terrible.
Terrible indeed. Did you get a look? You said you saw first one plane. Did you get a look at that plane?
Yeah, it looked like a big passenger liner, yeah.
Well, American Airlines says it was one of their passenger airlines that hijacked. Did you get a look at the second plane?
Yeah, it looked like a small jet, double engine maybe, you know, one of those corporate jets, I guess, and it looked like that. It hit so fast.
American Airlines, another one of their commercial jets, but a smaller jet.
Version, yeah.
Now, tell us about, in the case of the first plane, about how high up on that tower did it hit?
It hit at least 20, anywhere between 20 to 25 stories below the tower.
So it's a 110-story building, so you'd say
about 90, maybe
85, 90 stories.
And it made a gigantic hole.
And the second plane?
Hit a lot lower, like in mid-section of the building, like around 450, 60, around there.
Now, as terrible as it is, you said that you saw some people jump from the buildings.
I thought it was debris, but you've seen people jumping off that building. It was ugly. It was terrible. I've seen a lot of things in my lifetime, but I just can't imagine jumping off a building 110 stories high. I mean, it was terrible. It was just chaos everywhere. The explosion, the floors were shaking. I mean, the second. No exaggeration, 150 by 200 each way. That's how big it was. And it was rocking. Debris everywhere.
The ground shook?
Yeah, I got stuff all over my car, too.
Was there a great rumble, or was it just one huge boom?
Yeah, one big boom.
That was the first plane.
The first one was, yeah, it had a loud sound. I thought it went inside the building. I thought it looked like it was going to hit the building, then like fall down. It didn't. It went right through, like a rocket. Went right through the building. Then it exploded inside, and there was debris, paper, smoke. It was just ugly.
Rocky Pasafaro, thank you for coming in. We appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
We go to Washington and Jim Stewart. Jim?
Dan. Piece together a timeline which will assist them in their investigation, but quite frankly, at this point, don't answer as many questions as they raise. Let me run through with you what they report to be the sequence of events. The first explosion took place at 8:40 a.m., and this was the American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles. It crashed into the World Trade Center. At 9:04, the picture that we have seen now many times is the United Flight 175, also from Boston to Los Angeles, it too crashing into the World Trade Center, the second tower. The next explosion occurred at 9:38. That was in Washington, D.C., and involved American Airlines Flight 77. which was traveling from Dulles International Airport in Washington to Los Angeles. That plane crashed into the Pentagon. The fourth plane remains the big mystery. That was United Flight 93, Dan, which was departing Newark for San Francisco. It did not crash until a full hour after the Pentagon explosion. It went down at 10:20 a.m., according to the FBI, in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And the sequence of events there was that this flight abruptly changed course en route from Newark to San Francisco, somewhere over Pennsylvania, and headed directly toward the Washington, D.C. area. According to senior officials who were in the command centers at FBI headquarters, there was literally a moment of great panic. They anticipated that this aircraft was headed toward the Washington area. The FAA informed the FBI that the flight path of that aircraft would take it over Camp David. An attempt was made, we are told, to communicate with that aircraft, and there was no response. Now, we are also told that there was a response. There was some sort of communication with the other aircraft, so that part of this mystery is unclear, but apparently someone on these aircraft communicate back to the ground. Whether it was the pilots signaling distress or whether it was the people who had hijacked them is not known at this time. But the confusion over the Camp David is clearly that. This aircraft, United Aircraft Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco, changed course abruptly and was on a flight path that was taking it over Camp David, headed directly toward the Washington area, when it mysteriously crashed. What caused that crash is entirely unclear at this point. Finally, intelligence officials say officially that they are attributing this, that has the, quote, signature of Al-Qaeda, which is the terrorist organization belonging to Osama bin Laden, but they go on to say, and I quote, "It is our leading theory, but it is only that. It is a theory. It has his signature. It fits with his past pattern of terrorist events against the United States." Dan?
Jim Stewart in Washington. The Federal Aviation Agency, the FAA, confirms now that all U.S. domestic flights have landed safely. Airports around the country, as they were directed to do, have shut down, some for the first time in their history. This is obviously an unprecedented situation, the situation being many people, how many we do not know, but many people have lost their lives in the collapse of the World Trade Centers here after each of the Trade Center buildings, 110 stories high, was hit by an aircraft. There have been fatalities at the Pentagon when a plane was crashed into the U.S. Defense Department there. And in this situation, there's much that is known already, but there's so much more that is unknown. The Walt Disney Company has shut down its U.S. parks and has begun what it calls assessing global operation. Disneyland in Tokyo and Paris are still open. It's this kind of thing that a lot of corporations are going to have to be making some decisions as the hours go by here. The Emmy Awards scheduled for Sunday have been canceled. Pope John Paul II condemned what he called the unspeakable horror of today's inhumane terrorist attacks, unquote, the Pope. Now, President Bush has spoken twice today, once in just after the first attacks became clear on the World Trade Centers. He was in Florida, doing some work there with school children. Also, we mentioned earlier his brother's in a gubernatorial re-election situation there. The president was on a domestic trip to Florida. He spoke there, said he was going back to Washington, but he didn't. He was next reported at Barksdale Air Force Base outside Shreveport, Louisiana. There he made a videotape, somewhat more extensive statement. The president doing one that these were in effect cowardly acts, and that they would at least eventually be punished. That was the S of his remarks. He also called for calm and for the American people to know that their government was continuing to work, continuing to operate. All this is a paraphrase of the president, and the president on both occasions asked for the prayers of those families most directly affected by the death and destruction wrought today. Now, the situation at the moment is here in New York. Hospitals are absolutely overwhelmed. Keep in mind how many hospitals there are in New York. The mayor told us, I think it's something like 150 or 60 hospitals. The hospital situation is being stabilized now. Obviously, in the early going, they had to triage out. Triage meaning, make decisions on who gets immediate treatment and who does not. The situation in the hospitals is, what last report was beginning to stabilize because there is so much hospital help available in New York and in the surrounding areas. Some of the casualties were taken to hospitals outside New York into the suburban areas. Some elements of the National Guard have been called into service in New York to back up New York's outstanding police and fire departments. The police and fire departments here, of course, in this large city, being very large, some 40,000 plus police. When you the transit police available here, very large fire department, but no city anywhere in the world could count only on its own resources when attacked in this way. Now, police say no one is going to the World Trade Center until the fire is out, and the fire is definitely not out. There are people believed trapped inside the debris of the now totally collapsed World Trade Centers. Both of the World Trade Centers have collapsed. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani told us in our CBS News interview that some of the people found have been trapped. Others leaped from the building in terror, in effect forced out by the fire and explosions. And one pauses almost every time you see these scenes, because if you didn't know that this was real, and this videotape was taken as it happened, and you see some debris and in some cases people coming down the side of the building, you would say it must be from a horror movie. It is horrible. It is not a movie. John Serra, forgive me, is on the telephone. He was on the 47th floor of one of the World Trade Center buildings when the plane hit. So thank you for being with us. What was it like?
It was very scary. We thought it was a bomb at first. The whole building shook. I was in number 1 World Trade Center, 47th floor, and I work in securities area. And first we thought it was a bomb. Then we all ran towards the main door away from the windows. And we saw debris flying outside and everything. And then out in the hall, there's a lot of smoke. So we stayed in the office. We didn't go out into the hallway. We tried to get in touch with people to find out what was going on. Someone's relative called and said that it was on CNN that a plane had crashed into the building. And another person I work with called and spoke to a friend she knew down in security, and he confirmed that, and they told us to stay put, not to leave yet. A few minutes later, we were told it was okay to start going down the stairs, and we all, it was about 45 of us. We waited till everybody got out, and then we started down the stairs, and there was not that much smoke in the stairways, and we all had wet rags and kept it in front of our face, and when we got out into the stairs, people were coming down from the 70th and 80th floors, and later on we saw some injured people. People would yell down, "Stay to your right," and people that had burns and some were cut up or whatever. We went down first, and also some pregnant women shut down. Everybody was very helpful and orderly in the stairs, and then we started seeing firemen. Firemen were coming up, walking up, carrying equipment, and at one floor, people were passing out bottles of water from the water machine, so we could, pour the water on our heads and keep the rags wet. And the smoke was not that bad, we were able to get down slowly, and I think it was 10 o'clock when I got out of the building, and that's when some debris, and I was across the street, and we ran down into a subway entrance. At that point, I became covered with the soot and the ash and everything. And then I just walked up north as far as I could, up Broadway. My sister works at Spring Street in the Village, and I went to her office. She wasn't at work, but the people in the office helped me clean up, and then I walked across the Williamsburg Bridge into my sister's house in Greenpoint. And I was able to contact my wife and children, let them know I was okay, and friends. It was horrible. It was unbelievable. I cannot fathom that the building collapsed. I can't.
John Serra.
Yes.
Eyewitness who was on the 47th floor of one of the World Trade Center buildings. Thank you.
Thank you.
For your moving eyewitness account.
Thank
we
you.
go to Los Angeles. Brian Jenkins, with the Rand Corporation, one of the world's ranking experts on terrorism. Mr. Jenkins, thank you for being with us. This is unprecedented today. Give us some context for it.
It is unprecedented in terms of the enormity of scale of this attack. It has long been feared by those who analyze terrorism, who look at these things, that we could see a major attack on U.S. soil. And certainly there have been many scenarios that have been tested in the various exercises that have been conducted in cities across the United States. But there is nothing in the exercises that prepares you for the stunning images that we have seen today that will take us years to digest.
Mr. Jenkins, there's never been a similar occasion, but on other occasions there's been a lot of conclusion jumping, and a lot of the conclusion jumping has been wrong. Now, there is a sort of center of gravity building around the belief that this is the work somehow, some way, of Osama bin Laden and his organization. Give us some perspective on that.
Certainly, the Osama bin Laden organization would have to be included in any short list of suspects, but it's really too early to jump to any conclusions. Keep in mind that it has been less than 6 hours since the first attack. Now, clearly, in terms of the enormity of the attack, the kind of an organization that would be required, the resources that would be required to carry this out, the style of the attack, that is consistent with some of the modus operandi that we've seen come out of the Middle East in the past. But let's wait to take a conclusion as to who is responsible. Right now we know what has happened. It will take some hours, some days, potentially even some weeks to figure out who did it and exactly why they did it, if they needed a why.
Brian Jenkins in Los Angeles from the RAND Corporation. Scott Pelley is in Lower Manhattan.
Dan, thank you, Officer. Dan, I've made it down nearly to the base of the World Trade Center. I can see the building here. It is... Dan, it's very difficult to describe. What I see left of one of the World Trade Center towers looks to be about 10 or 15 stories tall. There is black smoke rising over the... Police officers are moving. The smoke is coming out. There's a building next. There are two buildings next to the World Trade Center. Both of them are involved in fire. There's fire shooting out of the windows of those two buildings. Large pieces of glass and pieces of these buildings to the street. Dan, the scene here on West Broadway is astonishing. New York City traffic was stopped and incinerated right in the street. I see a number of New York City police cars that were obviously the first responders to the catastrophe that have been blasted to pieces, thrown over on their sides, and burned. There are a number of U.S. postal vehicles in the street that have literally, Dan, just melted. U.S. postal trucks that have melted in the street. There is a large bus, could be a city bus, might be a Greyhound bus. Impossible to tell because it has been completely burned away, and is sitting just in the middle of West Broadway. As I reported to you earlier, the street is thick with several inches of muck that is made of construction material and files and paperwork, all sorts of things that were in the World Trade Center building. But Dan, the site of the building itself, the site of the World Trade Center tower that I can see here is a hulk about 15 stories tall, shattered, broken at the top, with huge columns of smoke rising in front of the sun. Sorry, it's very smoky down here. And the smoke has turned bright orange as it rises over Manhattan because of the back from the sun. Dan?
Scott Pelley, live from Lower Manhattan. Now, as part of our CBS News continuing coverage of the events of this day, I want to point out to you that every half hour, on the half hour and on the hour mark, we'll try to give you a summation of late information and what's happened during the day. So, if you're not riveted to the television screen, just know that at or about the half-hour mark and the hour mark, we'll try to bring you up to date. Now, no suburban service in the only train service is leaving the city. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has called what's called an emergency meeting for 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That'd be about 25 minutes from now. New York City hospitals now report themselves to be in, quote, desperate need of blood. We mentioned earlier that this was inevitable. It has happened. The American Red Cross is keeping New York City donor stations open. Now, if you're saying to yourself, what can I do? One of the things you can do is arrange to give blood if you're in an area, especially if you're in an area of New York City away from the downtown area where all the emergency work is being done, and let national basis. There's a shortage of blood supplies, and when you have a catastrophic event such as this, and it's no good describing it as any other way, you have a catastrophic event such as this, there are bound to be shortages of blood. So if you want anything you can do to help in this situation and in general, one would be to give blood. The Pennsylvania Medical Society has been asked to begin collecting names of volunteer doctors to travel to New York City and to the District of Columbia. Remember that the Pentagon was hit. To what extent the damage there, we do not know. What we do know is that there have been some fatalities at the Pentagon. How many? We do not know. There's absolutely no way to know what the casualties are, but mark well. This is a scene of the Pentagon where the smoke still bellows along the flats of the Potomac. The Pentagon in Northern Virginia, of course, just across the Potomac from the District of Columbia itself. But the casualties are expected to be very high from the World Trade Center collapse. Some people are said to be in the debris. They're trying to organize to get those people out. But it's no good ducking or dodging around the facts that particularly in the World Trade Center, the casualties are going to be high. Senator John McCain, United States Senator from Arizona, is on the telephone with us now. Senator McCain, thank you for being with us. Tell us what you know.
And I don't know much more than what you do. I think it's been very well covered. I say that this is a great nation. We can overcome this. We'll rally behind the president. We will find out who perpetrated this outrage. We will punish them, and we will ensure that it doesn't happen again. And I want Americans, if I could add my small voice, we should remain calm. We're a great nation. We can overcome this. And the best way that the great nation acts is that we get through this tragedy and we make sure that happens again.
Senator McCain, if you can stay with us for just a moment,
Sure,
we're going to switch to New York Mayor Giuliani live. He's holding a statement. Hold on with us now. Thank you.
Send a message that the city of New York and the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists, that our democracy, that our rule of law, that our strength and our willingness to defend ourselves will ultimately prevail. And I'd ask all of New York City to do everything that they can to cooperate, not to be frightened, to go about their lives as normal. Everything is safe right now in the city, and the people who are doing the relief effort need all the help they can get. And then, Governor, thank you very much for your assistance and your help and your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, for your leadership through this crisis. This is a vicious attack upon it's an attack upon America. It's an attack upon the whole concept of freedom and our way of life. And we cannot let these attacks succeed. The first step has to be to make sure we do everything in our power to protect the people and to save the lives of those whose lives are still at risk and to help those who have been injured. And I want to commend the mayor, and I want to thank my colleagues from Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the federal government have all offered and made support to help us deal with this ongoing crisis. The people of New York are not only the freest and most diverse people in the world, we're also, I believe, the most capable of rising to meet the challenges of this type of attack. And right now we want New Yorkers to remain calm, to go about their business, to appreciate the fact that everything to provide for their safety is being done, to appreciate that everything that can be done to provide for the health and the needs of people who are still at risk is being done, and that we will continue to work to make sure that we get through this as strongly and quickly as possible. I want to thank the federal administration. Secretary Thompson has been on the phone with me a number of times, as well as the president, for what they are offering and prepared to do. And we're just confident that, well, this is a horrible attack and one that is despicable and really unthinkable in its magnitude. We will get through this. and we will continue to have a great and free country.
Governor Pataki of New York, standing at the side of New York City, Mayor Giuliani, on the phone with us, Senator John McCain. Senator, you're speaking to us from where?
I'm on Capitol Hill, Dan.
Senator, this is a time for assessing what has happened to us today, as well as extending what we can in the way of, and our prayers to the families of those who've been most directly affected. But the question hangs out there that we pride ourselves on the defense of the United States of America, and we spend hundreds of billions of dollars preparing for, the eventuality of war. But how much thinking has gone into the new kind of war? This is something we haven't faced before.
Well, something that you and I have discussed in the past. We went from a very dangerous world to, during the Cold War, where we faced the threat of nuclear incineration, to a very dangerous world where we face these kinds of terrorist threats, including proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And I think the reality is that we'll have to assess our intelligence capabilities. I don't think there's doubt that we have superb technical intelligence capability. We abandoned to a large degree the human intelligence capabilities back in the late 1970s, and we may have to. I've always said that we needed to do more in that direction. I think that it is remarkable, some of the things already that we know, including the fact that these hijackers must have known how to fly an airplane. That's a pretty. Your average terrorist doesn't have that capability. The sophistication of this operation is mind-boggling, and obviously we're going to want to know why our intelligence capabilities were not what we wanted them to be.
Senator, true or untrue that there have been occasions over the last, let us say, decade, when the evidence pointed to some sort of state-sponsored terrorism? I'm not suggesting that this was state-sponsored terrorism. I'm saying clearly we don't know what this is. Yep. But is it true? There have been those occasions when the evidence pointed to certain states, and that for one reason or another, neither the executive nor legislative branch of our U.S. government wanted to attend to that. That just the decision was made to look the other way.
I don't know if the action was to just look the other way, but I think there were indications. Whether there was conclusive proof or not was a judgment that was made by our leaders, both in the executive and legislative branch. I have felt that there's been involvement, but I'll be honest with you, Dan, I never thought that an operation of this sophistication and size would take place. I just never did. But I don't think there's any doubt that countries, Iraq, Iran, Libya, North Korea, and others, who we know engage in proliferation of capabilities and have from time to time involved themselves in state-sponsored terrorism. But never did we imagine on a scale such as this.
Senator John McCain, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
The earliest the FAA says it would consider lifting ground bridges, this has to do with air traffic in this country, will be 12 noon tomorrow. Again, as we have so often, we need to pause and absorb that. This has never happened in the history of the country. The FAA early in the day said it wanted all flights in the country stopped. It just shut down in the situation. Now the FAA says that it will consider lifting the ground stoppages at or about 12 noon tomorrow. Obviously, that could be subject to change, but that's what the FAA says at the moment. Sandra Hughes, CBS News correspondent, is at LAX, the Los Angeles International Airport, where some of the flights involved in the hijacked suicide missions, as it turned out today, were headed. Sandra?
And the last few hours inside, excuse me, I'm just going to have to take this out of my ear because I can hear myself and it's very distracting. I've just spent the last few hours inside the LA International Airport. It is now evacuated and closed down. I spent most of my time at the American terminal, and we saw some family members, what appeared to be very grieving family members arriving. They were surrounded by police and whisked up the stairs to a private room. We're assuming that those were family members of some of the folks who were on those two American flights that crashed. But most of what we saw was chaos, confusion with the passengers there, people trying to book flights, most people just being told, go home, call later. We then walked down down to the United Terminal. A much different scene down there, Dan. It was a heightened state of security. Police tape was all around the terminal. It was completely closed down. We saw the Los Angeles Police Department bomb squad suiting up and going inside the United Terminal. We tried to get a little bit closer, and we were pushed back. Just
standing a little bit away from the
airport, we have seen many police cars with their lights and siren, the emergency vehicles rushing in that direction. So what appears to be a heightened state of alert. Right now, they are just continuing to evacuate everyone from the Los Angeles airport who is an essential personnel. Also, just around California, Disneyland, the major attractions, they've all been closed down. The Bay Bridge up in San Francisco, any major bridge like that in the state of California, a heightened state of alert. Many state buildings have been closed down and evacuated. That's what's going on here in California, Dan.
Sandra Hughes at Los Angeles International Airport. We go to Mika Brzezinski, who is live now in Lower Manhattan. Mika?
Yeah, Dan, I've just moved up from PS 89, which is 3 blocks from the scene, Dan, because what they've told me is that we had to get out. They were going to try and get rid of what's left of Tower 1, and I was in the line of fire, so I ran 10 blocks up to our south here on Canal and West. And I've had a first chance to take a look at what is behind me, and I can't believe it. This is Midtown Manhattan. This is New York. And the heart of it is a scene of terror and hate. I've also caught up with some families here. Dan, I don't know if you remember, I was speaking earlier at the school with a frantic father who was trying to find his son who went to PS 99. Those children were evacuated to nearby schools. He couldn't find his son. He also couldn't find his wife, who was at Gateway Plaza, the apartments right across from the World Financial Center when all this happened. His wife and his 3-year-old child were in there. He could only get close enough to see that the windows were blown out. And now I have with me Michael Gashler and Julie Brown and their 2.5-year-old son. I take it you live there as well. What can you tell me about the scene from what you know?
Well, it's Gateway Plaza right now is evacuated, basically. And what's happening is that there's another building that had come down. They called it Building 80. But what I understand for that father, the kids in school are safe. As we walked up,
the kids in all of the local schools, Stuyvesant High School, PS 89, which is right at the scene of the disaster, they have been transferred to nearby schools. PS 3 is one of them. They are all okay, but a lot of parents like you trying to find their families. And Gateway Plaza, it appears the apartments were not unscathed in this.
No, especially the ones facing the World Trade Center. They were blasted out, and we were lucky being in the apartment and not evacuating like they asked us to, because we were safe inside. We were able to close the windows, and we didn't then suffocate when the debris came down, when the buildings collapsed.
I take it as this happened, you were actually about to bring your son to a daycare center inside the World Trade Center?
Five World Trade Center, yeah. Plaza level. That's where we have it at the Children's Discovery Center. We don't know whatever happened to that, but I got to believe it's buried now with the debris. But we normally would be there at 8:30. And we just got up late, so we got lucky.
What is your reaction, Julie, to what you're hearing so far about this being an act of terror and seeing this literally at your home?
Well, having been down here when the bomb went off back in the early 90s, I don't know what to say about that. I'm still shocked over it all happening, and that time I was lucky enough not even to be at home. I was in Midtown, and this time being at home, I have to say that my first concern really was to get my son out of there.
Like many families who are right now struggling to be reunited, some of them will be lucky enough to have that happen. I also have with me Michael Ingbar, who was sleeping with earplugs on when the plane began to fly toward, one of the planes began to fly toward the World Trade Center. What happened after that?
I was just on my roof. I had my binoculars, and I'm looking at it, and I thought it was a Superman movie or something, or a science fiction movie. And then I saw a huge explosion. I saw people falling out of windows, and I couldn't tell whether they were jumping or they were just. And I put my binoculars on, and I saw it was actual people just jumping out of the buildings or falling out of the buildings, and just a big explosion, like it was explosion fire. It was like a movie set.
I think a lot of us do. A lot of us even covering the story. I was frantically at one point trying to get in touch with my husband, who's also a reporter. Everybody in some way, shape, or form is connected to this in some way, with so many people working inside the World Trade Towers, 50,000 people at height level, Dan. It is going to be an act of terror with reverberations across the country. And, of course, this morning we are still picking pieces and trying to figure out exactly exactly what happened, and there are people trying to figure it out, which is usually crowded with cars trying to get in the middle of the morning, and right now it is literally a walking path. The only thing you see coming through here right now are literally hundreds of fire trucks and EMS crews. When I was down there, I was close to the scene, at the scene, literally, when the towers came down. Byron Pitts and I were actually standing at the corner of Murrest, where you heard Scott Pelley reporting from, and we were there when the towers went down. We literally ran from the roll of thick debris and smoke to the point when we ran into PS 89 to get as far quickly escape from this sort of toxic cloud. Literally, when we got inside the school went black. It was like night, because when the cloud came over us and the debris started to hit, when you literally went back out, and where we were standing was only crushed cars, debris, and cement. Dan.
Mika Brzezinski, live, reporting from Lower Manhattan, although the picture you're seeing at this particular moment is videotape of the collapse of the World Trade Centers. Yes, both of the 110 stories World Trade Centers have collapsed. All U.S. security markets have closed. A conference call is scheduled tonight to decide whether to reopen tomorrow. Bellevue Hospital medical director, quote, "This is a catastrophe of unparalleled proportions," unquote. And the reason it is a result of what you're seeing on videotape. First one of the World Trade Center towers collapsed. Yes, collapsed. It looks like one of those scenes of an old building being, purposely dynamited and blown up. In this case, hijacked airliners, two, both of them American Airlines apparently, were crashed, first one then another, into the World Trade Center. And then first one tower and then the other collapsed, completely collapsed, and buildings around them collapsed. People were seen jumping, being forced out of the building on high floors. People on the street gasped as each person was seen coming out of a window. Abraham Lincoln, 1864. "Let not him who is houseless found the house of another. Let him work diligently and build one for himself, thus by his example, assuring that his own shall be safe from violence when built." Yes, it's a long quote, but something to ponder on this day.
America has much to ponder,
Including the fact, and it is a fact, that we've been taught since we were school children that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Clearly our vigilance was not been what it should have been in the days preceding this catastrophe today. And if you think the word catastrophe is an overstatement, then perhaps you want to rethink it. Because many, many people have died on this day. Some at the Pentagon. We hope a few. We don't know how many at the Pentagon when a plane crashed there. But the mayor of New York, police officials, everybody says when the death toll is finally counted from the total collapse of both of these towers of the World Trade Center, there will be a high loss of life. Some people are believed trapped in the remains as we speak, and operations are being mounted to try to get to them. You remember those scenes from Oklahoma City. Remember Oklahoma City, one federal building, terrible as it was, how long it took to get organized, to get those people who were trapped in the rooms, as was the case in Oklahoma City. Many heroic deeds this day, most of those deeds we do not yet know, but police, firemen, ordinary citizens.
And while many lives
have been lost, many lives have been saved. And it's a day that will, as was the case with Pearl Harbor, live in infamy in American history. We go to John Roberts in Washington. John, perhaps bring people up to date where the president is and where he isn't at this hour.
Well, Dan, as we try to grasp the enormity of this tragedy, and as many times as you see the pictures, they still hit you afresh, an assault against all your senses. It's just impossible to understand the exact magnitude of all of this. The White House is trying to put the pieces back together here so that they can show that they are in control, to show America that they have who is in command here and a person who is going to lead this country against the scourge of terrorism nationwide. Our what's called in-town travel pool was activated just a little while ago, been taken over to what we'll only describe as a government building in downtown Washington, D.C., for fear that people may be watching this broadcast in order to determine where the leaders of government are for a briefing about what the government does next. As best we can, Dan, the president president most recently was at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where he made the address that you played the videotape of just a short while ago, and is now somewhere in transit over the United States, whereabouts and destination classified at this point. We understand that the vice president is still in Washington, D.C., though the congressional leadership has been ferried separately via separate helicopters to ocean outside. But Dan, I think, and this has now been corroborated by two different sources now, there is a move by the White House to try to get the president back to the White House today. Dan, you mentioned a couple of hours ago now, at least, that the president want to get back to the White House today as a show of force against these terrorists. I believe that the administration is of the same mind, and they are in negotiations now with the Secret Service, sure that they can adequately assure the safety of the president so they can get him back to the White House. Speaking against that, Dan, though, might be this idea that when the president on Air Force One left Barksdale Air Force Base, they trimmed down the number of media personnel, the White House press corps, who was following him from about 14 to 5, which may indicate that they were going to a smaller location, Dan. So still the information somewhat up in the air. This again classified because they do not want to reveal where the president or the vice president are at this point. But we should know more very soon. We'll get back to you on that.
Our White House correspondent John Roberts, and emphasizing that whenever the President of the United States travels, he's on Air Force One, he has an incredibly sophisticated communication system aboard that aircraft. And while, as John Roberts mentioned, from all appearances and all reports, Vice President Dick Cheney, a very experienced appointed official, is in charge at the White House itself, in a secure position below ground in the White House, we believe. And Condoleezza Rice, head of the National Security Council, while on a minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour basis, at some point it appears that they were very much, at least in partial charge. Let no one, no matter how you feel politically, misunderstand. The President of the United States is in charge. He is the commander-in-chief. And whatever anybody thinks of him or doesn't think of him in the moment, he's the commander-in-chief. He's the leader of the nation. He is in Air Force One. He is in instantaneous communication when he wants to be any place in the world, and there should not be any misunderstanding about that. There'll be plenty of time later in the days and weeks to follow about whether he and his White House operation deported themselves as they could have and should have today. But at this moment, no one should have any misunderstanding about the president being in charge. And with that in mind, we go to Bob Schieffer in Washington. Bob?
Well, Dan, very much in line with what John Roberts was saying about members of the White House staff wanting to get the president back to Washington because they believe that is the way to show the terrorists.
There's very much
that same spirit up at the Capitol at this point. The Capitol Police Chief was just a while ago that congressional leaders are going to make a decision later today about reopening the Capitol tomorrow because they think that is the way to show that this government is still working. Joe Biden, who's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, said earlier this afternoon, this Congress ought to be in session. When we're not in session, we're saying to the terrorists that they are winning at this point, and we don't want them to say that. So that is the mood. But of course, as John Roberts also pointed out, there are these tremendous security precautions and considerations that have to be taken at this point. So at this point, all we know is that the vice president, for example, is in a secure place. That is the only clue that members of his staff will give us as to where he is at this point. He's with his chief of staff, Louis Libby. Lynn Cheney is also with him. But the White House staff tells us only the vice president is in a secure place. One other point, intelligence sources at this point have really not given members of Congress a great deal of information. Either they don't know or they're holding back on that. We are told that there will be substantive intelligence briefings, members of the intelligence committees later this afternoon, but at this point about all they know is that these were well-coordinated attacks, well-coordinated, well-planned out. At this point, it's our understanding that members of Congress have been given no information as to who specifically might be behind these attacks. We should also add, and these intelligence sources it out to us, that security forces, American forces around the world, have been on a considerably high state of alert in recent weeks, almost since the bombing of the USS Cole some months ago. Everybody has been expecting something. Nobody really expected anything of this gravity. Certainly nobody expected something as widespread as attacks were. But that about brings it up to date as far as we can determine at this point, Dan.
Bob Schieffer live in Washington. This is CBS News continuing live coverage of the incredible acts of terrorism that were put forward today. Reporting, I am from CBS News World headquarters in New York. And here's what we know and what we don't know up to this hour. It's been one of the most horrifying attacks ever against the United States on home soil. Terrorists crashed two airliners. Two hijacked airliners, apparently American Airlines commercial jets, into the World Trade Center. This deadly series of blows brought down the twin 110-story towers. A plane also rammed into the Pentagon as the itself was brought under attack. Now, we want to show you in sequence what happened this morning at the World Trade Centers. These buildings at the tip of Manhattan. First, an aircraft, and that is the plane, comes in and hits a World Trade Center building. This was the second hit, if you will, I believe. Then after the two planes, one hit one tower, then another tower. You see the plane went deep into the building, and indeed one witness said it almost came out the other side. That was a quote. Then, incredibly, unbelievably, almost inconceivably, one of the huge twin towers began to collapse from the top, quickly cascading down, completely, totally destroyed. A rain of steel and concrete, buildings around began to collapse. A horrific sight. And then, as before that could even be absorbed as a fact, the second tower began to collapse. Those events between just before 9 Eastern Time this morning and around 10 a.m. Eastern Time this morning. And then another plane crashed into a helipad near the Pentagon and put part of the Pentagon in Washington, the U.S. Defense Department headquarters, in flames and filled with smoke. The Defense Department later confirmed there had been some fatalities. They did not say how many, and there were injuries at this place. Then there was a plane crash, apparently, reportedly and supposedly a crash plane. Hospital's been trying to get the facts on that. Russ?
That's right, Dan. United Airlines says Flight 93, which was a Boeing 757, left Newark, New Jersey at 8:01 this morning Eastern Time, was headed for San Francisco with 38 passengers, 2 pilots, and 5 flight attendants. United Airlines has confirmed that plane did crash about 80 miles from Pittsburgh. There are no survivors, according to United, at this time.
Russ Mitchell. And then there is the case of a plane is believed to have crashed in the area of the presidential retreat at Camp David, Maryland, but quite frankly, the facts on that remain in some doubt. Now, we're told that President Bush has just landed at Moffett Air Force Base in Nebraska. The president started the day in Florida. He was on a out-of-Washington trip to Florida. Then he turned up at Barksdale Air Force Base outside Shreveport, Louisiana, made his second statement of the day. Now, we're told Moffett Air Force Base in Nebraska. Why would he go there? Well, for one thing, the DEFCOM planes are headquartered at this place in Moffett Air Force Base, we're told, and that is that there are special aircraft which, in case of, say, a nuclear attack or other national emergency, that the president could board one of those aircrafts. They have special facilities in case of a national emergency. Now, I want to emphasize the president's been traveling in air but is not, in fact, a so-called DEFCON plane. That's a special aircraft. We don't know that President Bush is boarding one of these DEFCON planes. We're told what we know, and all we know, is that he went from Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport to Moffett Air Force Base Base in Nebraska, and he's now receiving what's called as an up-to-date briefing at the Air Base in Nebraska. Where he intends to go after this, if anywhere today, is unknown. We'll try to keep you posted as we go along on the president's movements, but a decision was made. He said first, when he was in Florida, he said he was going back to Washington. But a decision was made that he was not going to do that. It was unannounced, as probably should not. He wound up in Barksdale Air Force Base, and now is at Moffett Air Force Base in Nebraska, where it said that he's getting a briefing. And let me pause and say that I've made a mistake here. The responsibility is mine and the blame is mine. It is Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, not Moffett. Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. So the situation at this hour, let's review. The casualties are many. There are many dead, and New York hospitals are overflowing with the wounded from the collapse, the twin collapse of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. There have been some fatalities, the number unknown at the Pentagon when an aircraft was crashed into the Pentagon. American commercial airlines say that at least 4 planes were hijacked this morning as part of what appears to be a concerted terrorism. American Airlines says 2 of its planes were crashed into the World Trade Center. That would be American Airlines Flight 77, Dulles to Los Angeles, and American Flight 11, Boston to Los Angeles. And let me note, asterisk bottom of the page, mentally, if you will, that this there's some discrepancy. The eyewitnesses, several eyewitnesses, said they thought that one of the planes that hit one of the World Trade Centers was not a large airliner. Now, a Dulles to Los Angeles flight would figure to be quite a large airliner, and a Boston to Los Angeles flight would figure to be quite a large airliner. We have no explanation for that. A Boeing 757, one of the planes believed to have crashed in the World Trade Center, and a Boeing 767, another plane believed to have crashed into the other World Trade Center. That'll perhaps be sorted out as time goes along, but American says it believes that its 2 planes, these 2 planes, crashed into the World Trade Centers. Then United Flight 175, also a Boeing 767, large aircraft, flying Boston to Los Angeles, was hijacked in flight. And then United Flight number 93, Newark to San Francisco, another Boeing 757, was hijacked. Those are the 4 planes known to have been hijacked. Bill Richardson, one time, in fact, until fairly recently, head of the Department of Energy in Washington, also once the United States ambassador to the United Nations, very experienced politically, and also someone who's been involved with intelligence information about terrorist networks, is with us in our Washington Bureau. Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you again.
Thank you, Dan.
Try to give us some perspective here. Also, let's address the alleged bin Laden connection to all this.
It seems to me, Dan, and I used to every morning get an intelligence briefing that I don't get anymore, but my sense, Dan, is that this was a coordinated attack. It took a lot of resources. It basically points to a sophisticated network that would be bin Laden. I recall when I was UN ambassador to get him extradited, going to Afghanistan, and basically getting stiff-armed by the Taliban. Now, I think what is very important here, Dan, is besides dealing with the tragedy, besides supporting the president fully, he is fully in charge, and we should come together as a country. I think it's important that we ensure and take steps right away so that this doesn't happen again. I think we need a massive effort to upgrade our terrorism capability. I think the war is not just a missile war or a military war. We've got terrorism that crosses borders. Secondly, I always sensed that when I was in the government that we had a lot of very good agencies, a lot of good people dealing with terrorism, but somehow we need better coordination. I would put terrorism SAR. I think also we need a national commission appointed by the president to look at what happened and what steps we need to take, bipartisan, to deal with this massive attack on America. So those are the steps that I think we need to take. Obviously, we need to upgrade our human intelligence, as Senator McCain said, basically spies infiltrating some of these terrorist cells, but also satellites, because this is such a massive attack that I think we needed both more human intelligence, but also more satellite and the kind of sophisticated intelligence that we've been investing so much in.
Mr. Secretary, based on your experience with looking into these kinds of things, and you said you made a trip to Afghanistan trying to get the Taliban government to help with catching Osama bin Laden. After there were attacks on the U.S. embassies in Eastern Africa in 1998, President Clinton authorized 2 sets of missile attacks, cruise missile attacks, one against in Afghanistan, one in the Sudan, in retaliation for what he said were clear indications that Osama bin Laden, and pointed out bin Laden's connections to Sudan and Afghanistan. My is that after those attacks, bin Laden became even bigger in the minds of those haters of America, particularly those who are of Muslim religion, than he was before. So what I'm grasping for is some indication of what does a nation such as ours, what are the options for this or any other president when this kind of thing happens? The last time, I say, one of the last, we launched these missile attacks, and frankly, the evidence is that they didn't do much good.
Dan, I think the president has a limited option here, and the option is if we can find bin Laden, locate him, get good enough intelligence, a massive retaliation against them. I think that's called for very clearly if he is the perpetrator. The second thing, Dan, is we need to get the international community, our allies, our friends, developing countries, to recognize that terrorism is a worldwide threat, that this has happened to everybody, so we've got to get more international cooperation, NATO, Asian nations, African nations. And thirdly, there's got to be a response against the countries like Afghanistan that may harbor these terrorists, or certain countries in the Middle East that if they turn them over, and they have them, they can't use legalisms, and that they would also be subject to a very tough response. I think, Dan, with terrorism, you deal with it, needless to say, we need a stronger intelligence capability. We need to be better prepared. But we also have to have an international effort. We can't do it alone. But I think the most important step here, Dan, is we got to rally around the president, rally around as a country. This is an unprecedented attack. We've been violated. But you've got to start planning for the next day to ensure that this never happens again.
Former Secretary of Energy, former Ambassador to the United Nations for the U.S., Richardson, we thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thanks for being with us. We mentioned that the missile attacks, the twin attacks against Sudan and Afghanistan targets in the wake of the embassy bombings, the U.S. embassy bombings in East Africa in 1998. I think it was said, probably said by me, that the indication is they didn't do a lot of good. Let me amplify on that to say that Sander Berger, who was head of the National Security Council at the time that decision was made, among many others, has said, look, just because we didn't get bin Laden, just because we didn't hit the targets in some cases may thought we were hitting, one of the purposes at that time was to send a message that we have reach, that we can reach the terrorists wherever they are. So for fairness and for accuracy, one needs to tack that on to the statement that, well, the evidence is that those missile attacks may not have done much good. Fuad Ajami, our CBS News consultant, longtime expert on foreign affairs, not just Middle East, is with us here for context and perspective. Fuad Ajami of Johns Hopkins University, you've been listening and monitoring carefully to what the leaders of the Taliban have said today. Now, among other things, they've said that bin Laden is not connected to this.
Right. Well, this is the Taliban, so you have to take whatever they say with some skepticism. The Taliban would like to hunt with the hounds and run with the fox. They have given sanctuary to Osama bin Laden, but they now insist that Osama bin Laden has been domesticated, that he doesn't have the logistics, he doesn't have the base with which to do these kinds of operations. I think we have to treat this with caution, and I think you've been doing, you've been trying to give this story the context that it deserves, and to deal with the horror without really trying to name people and designate culprits, because we simply do not know. But we do know that Osama bin Laden has been active in this kind of industry of terror. He's a wholesaler of terror. And we do know that in the East Africa bombings of both Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, he was implicated. We suspect that he was implicated on the attack on the USS Cole, where two of his followers, we think, in effect hit one of our destroyers. And so we have arrived at this point now. And of course, the Taliban will be very, very cautious this round because they suspect that this time the response will not be pinpricks, it will be a very serious response.
Fuad, you've been studying this kind of thing for so long. There's always talk when this kind of thing happens. Couldn't happen without some state being involved.
Right.
Iraq, Iran, Libya, Syria, North Korea, run down a list.
Right.
Is that talk realistic?
Well, it's really honestly, we just have no idea. I mean, I think this is a very slippery, the whole realm of speculation this far. I mean, we do know that obviously these kinds of terrorist operations must have sanctuaries. You know, it's not just one or two people who could do it. And we do know that it's the fate of a liberal power like us, like this great superpower, to be envied, to be resented. And look at this attack. This attack targets the Pentagon, the World Trade Center. It targets the symbol of our military might and the symbol of our financial, economic might. So both New York and Washington are the main targets. And it is a message to a great power that even though our wingspan is broad, even though our economic resources are vast, even though our military infrastructure and our military might is vast, we are vulnerable to these kinds of operations. And we do know that there is tremendous anti-Americanism in large parts of the world. In large parts of the world, there's tremendous amount of anti-Americanism. In the world of Islam in particular, we understand this. But there is this anti-Americanism, and people like bin Laden feed off it. And bin Laden, in many ways, he is this, you know, not only is he active in a place like Afghanistan where they give him sanctuary, but there's sympathy for him everywhere. Because bin Laden, if you will, holds out the message that this great hegemon, this great superpower that straddles the world can still be hurt. And we are hurt by this. We have seen this.
But no doubt we're hurt. We have, well, we believe hundreds and possibly thousands of our fellow citizens dead. I want to hold to this point about certainly no one can speculate, and I've said repeatedly and want to say again, that early reports and speculation in these kind of situations, they are frequently wrong. Sure. Oklahoma City comes to mind. But right behind that, let me pause for a second and help our viewers and listeners. You've said, look, there is centered in the world of Christianity or Judaism, anything, there's centered, hate America elements. But I'm sensitive, I want to be sensitive to the fact that there are many loyal Americans, peaceful, loving Americans who have Islamic heritage.
Of course.
And we need to pause, I think, for just a second, if I may say, and let's talk about that. What as a national attitude we should have toward our fellow Americans who are of Islamic religion.
Well, I think you've said it, Dan. I mean, you've even mentioned the Oklahoma City bombing as the cautionary tale. As we jumped to look for Middle Eastern sources of that deed, it turned out to be just a clean-cut kid who was responsible for it. So I think no one is really jumping to conclusions, but obviously 4 planes that get hijacked. This isn't, basically your garden variety episode. This is a very major episode. We've crossed the Rubicon. In effect, that our sense of immunity to the currents of the world and to the passions and the furies of now lies behind us. I mean, we said this in a small way. In 1993, the first time the World Trade Center was hit some 8 years ago. But this is a different order of magnitude altogether. And our sense of immunity to the passions of that play on other societies, I think, is gone, and gone forever. I mean, we think that these things go on in Europe because Europe is close to the fire, and it's close to there's a world to its east which is problematic, and then there is a world to its south which is unstable. But we have entered this. And the experience of the Israelis is a great cautionary tale. Liberal societies are vulnerable to these kinds of attacks because there are all kinds of protections that individuals are accorded. And we accord them this because there's no other way. There's no other way of doing it. It's not being a liberal democracy. democratic society, it's the price we pay for power. Power begets nemesis in the world. So we sit astride the world, but in effect we pay the price of this ascendancy, the price of this kind of power. And we have this sense of innocence, we carry it with us, and we are innocent of these kinds of furies and these kinds of passions. But obviously bin Laden doesn't think we're innocent. He thinks that we support the House of Saud, which he himself is a Saudi citizen and would like to overthrow the House of Saud.
In Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. And bin Laden thinks that we are implicated in what Israel is doing. And bin Laden thinks that we represent secularism when he would like to see a theocratic world in the Islamic world. And so the bin Ladens, their main threat in many ways is to the poor Islamic world that they have wrecked and ruined. And we are visited by these kinds of today.
As we look at these pictures, these horrifying pictures, some of them live, some of them on videotape today.
Yes.
And this picture, I mean, this is going to go down as one of the great photographs of all time, the plane actually coming into the World Trade Center. The 20th century was marked by wars characterized by clanking machinery and clashing ideologies. Is or is not what we're seeing today the face of 21st century war?
I think you're absolutely right. And this is the freelancer. This is the individual. Like it could only be, like here we sit, we are trying to understand the story. And fundamentally, in the end, it took 4 people, let's say, if it's really these 4 people who hijacked these planes, it will turn out to be, if there's any guide, and we ever get to the bottom of this story, it will turn out to be 4 young people in their 20s. They are available for these kinds of missions. They believe that this is the way to paradise or the way to redemption. And here we are talking about the whole idea of building, I mean, it's ironic and painful in retrospect. We're talking about the idea of building a missile shield for this country. Well, missile shield doesn't protect you against kids who can get on 4 planes and take these planes and smash them into the World Trade Center and into the Pentagon. So it is the face of the 21st century, and it is the age of the freelancer. And we live with this. It's our fate, and it's the fate of power because of this connection between power and the nemesis that is always generated by power.
Well, as you point out, when a nation is a combined superpower, and the world's only combined superpower, that is a military superpower and an economic superpower, you have many vulnerabilities. There is the vulnerability of missiles from rogue states, which the so-called missile shield is supposed to finish against. But then there are these other vulnerabilities, some of which have been exposed today. Fuad Ajami, thanks.
Thank you.
Hope to talk to you as we go along. I want to straighten out one thing now that we have it straightened out. Here's what the aircraft involved in this morning's events. American Airlines Flight 11, that's the one took off from Boston, headed for Los Angeles, was hijacked, a Boeing 767 with 81 passengers and 11 crew members. This was the first of the 2 planes that struck the World Trade Center, apparently the first. Then, American Flight 77, Dulles Airport near Washington to Los Angeles, a Boeing 757 with 58 passengers and 6 crew. This is the plane that apparently hit near the Pentagon. Now, that's a change from what we believed was the case before. We thought that American Airlines had said both of its planes hit the World Trade Center, and about that we were apparently wrong, that the information we gave you was not correct. We now believe that American Flight 11 was the first to hit the World Trade Center. American Flight 77 coming out of Dulles hit the Pentagon. Then United Flight 175, Boston to Los Angeles, a Boeing 767 with 56 passengers and 9 crew. This apparently was the second plane to hit the World Trade Center. Now, with this new information, both of the aircraft that hit the World Trade Center originated in Boston, bound for Los Angeles. Both of them were Boston to LA flights. One an American Airlines flight, the other a United flight. And then United Flight 93, originating in Newark, New Jersey, headed to San Francisco with 38 passengers and 7 crew. This is the plane that apparently went down in Somerset County in western Pennsylvania, about 80 miles from Pittsburgh. Those are the 4 planes that we know of that were hijacked today. 3 of them plunged by suicide. People who commanded the hijacking operation into 2 at the World Trade Trade Center, one at the Pentagon. We go to Mika Brzezinski in downtown New York. Mika.
Well, Dan, behind the fire trucks and the smoke and all the confusion that is now 10 blocks behind me, right down the West Side Highway here, is a horrendous and unimaginable mystery. Who made it out alive? The trade towers have vanished, and in their place, an ominous, slow-moving plume of smoke. Evacuations were so quick from the scene, from schools and buildings and apartments. There was no cell phone service at all, added to the confusion, and there's so little information coming about it out of the scene, about the injured and the dead, that people are literally lining up on the West Side Highway, waiting and watching. That is all they can do. Now, we know of terrorist acts throughout your reporting in other parts of the country, but it's safe to say most people here can barely deal with it right here in New York City. I'm joined by two guys here, Michael and Christopher, and they actually saw much of this disaster unfold before their eyes. First of all, Christopher, where were you?
I was in a nearby office building, several blocks away, in a conference room on the northwest corner of the building. We unfortunately had a very clear, unobstructed view of both towers. About 20 of us in the building or so, colleagues actually, gathered on one of the floors, one of the high floors.
So you heard the first hit, gathered and saw?
At least I didn't see the first hit, so we kind of gathered in this room, and we're just kind of discussing the events, and just within a matter of minutes, we noticed, again, what appeared to be, in such a short period of time, what appeared to be a large commercial plane at a low altitude, high speed, just, going right into the second tower, and it collided with Earth. The plane disintegrated, the building shattered, basically, and just a ball of fire. And,
in the room, the people around you, what? Was it silence?
It was. It's kind of hard. It's kind of really hard to. I believe so. Just complete and utter disbelief.
Christopher, tell us a little bit about the chaos in trying to literally get from where you were to where you are now. I understand you ran down 46 of stairs. Take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as we saw the second explosion, essentially, we just thought we're in, a 50, 60 floor building. We could be the next target. So we had no idea what was happening. You see two explosions like that, and everybody kind of just realized, wait, we're in danger too. And people just started, it wasn't chaos. It was just everybody was going as fast as they could down the stairs, and going down 46, 50 flights, it was pretty tough. We get out, and then all of a sudden you see just this fireball coming out of the towers. And it was just a surreal experience.
Yeah, Bedlam. And the blasts, of course, Dan, as we know, there was 1, 2, and then 3 as the towers collapsed. And one security expert from inside the financial center said literally hundreds of people from beyond the police line were covered by the falling debris and the building itself. Dan.
Mika Brzezinski.
Well, Lord.
President Bush, having started the day in Florida, made a short statement there, calling this an apparent terrorist attack. Then he flew to made another videotape statement there, somewhat longer, in both statements assuring Americans that their government was continuing to function and that those responsible for this would be found and be held accountable, and asking for the prayers and the families most directly affected by today's tragedies. Then the president flew on to Nebraska, to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, where he was last reported to be receiving, quote, a briefing on the situation. And at that particular Air Force Base in Nebraska are the DEFCON planes, which are aircraft outfitted particularly to carry presidents aloft in catastrophic situations. Now that President Bush is going to go on a DEFCON plane, so far as we know, he plans to continue to fly on Air Force One. But where he will go, where he will wind up, we do not know. He did not go back to Washington as he said he was going to do out of Florida. More about that as we go later on. Now we're approaching the half-hour mark. Every half hour, an hour, we try to recapitulate what we know, what we don't know, bring you up to date on the situation. Do that in a very few moments. But let me point out a couple of things before doing that. First of all, hospitals continue to be absolutely inundated with the wounded from today's events in and around the World Trade Center. Some patients have been taken to outlying hospitals, suburban hospitals outside the city. There is a shortage of blood, as you would expect under these circumstances, and the American Cross is keeping open the facilities for blood donations in the city, in those areas of the city that are not affected by the explosions and fire and events in Lower Manhattan. So those blood donation centers are open. The FAA says that air traffic, which has been grounded in the country in an unprecedented act since early this morning, that tomorrow noon is the earliest the FAA intends to have air transport authorized again. Overseas flights headed for this country were ordered to either U-turn or to find landing places outside the United States. NATO was holding what was described as an emergency meeting, which was due to begin about a half hour ago. A senior official is expected to brief shortly at the headquarters in Washington. We will, of course, be monitoring, probably carry it live for you. Also at the Pentagon, where there's been very little information about the extent of damage today, understandably little information. The Defense Department wanting to give out as few details as possible, but there has been damage at the Pentagon. There have been some fatalities there. The Defense Department confirmed that several hours ago, and some injured. But we'll also be receiving a Pentagon briefing somewhere along the line this noon. The pictures you're seeing now on videotape are from the World Trade Center area. Let me point out that it wasn't just the collapse of the twin towers of the World Trade Center, one tower and then the other, where 50,000 people generally work on any given workday and where thousands more generally visit, but there were buildings around the World Trade Center that in the avalanche of debris, the concrete and steel and other buildings raining down the whole area, there were other buildings in that section of New York, Lower Manhattan, that collapsed at or about the same time as the World Trade Center. The mayor of New York, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, has said that there's been a, quote, tremendous loss of life. In an interview with CBS News, he wouldn't even speculate as to how much loss of life. There, at last report, there were people known to be still alive in the debris of the World Trade Center collapse. Efforts were being organized to try to get to those people. Now, this is an unprecedented show of terrorist horror, what you're seeing today. The 110-story World Trade Center collapsed in this shower of rubble and dust and destruction. The airliners, carrying a lot of people themselves, slammed sides of the twin symbols of American capitalism. And Fuad Johnny from Johns Hopkins University pointing out that the two main targets today, one, a symbol of America's economic power, the World Trade Centers, the other, the symbol of American military power with the Defense Department. And no one can believe that those two main targets were selected at random. They were selected for their symbolic importance to the nation. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani said, and I quote him again, "Now the number of casualties will be more than most of us." No, this was a systematic terrorist attack that included another hijacked plane crashing into the Pentagon. And we very early on this morning said that this was the Pearl Harbor of terrorism. Then following that, at least one U.S. senator picked up on that theme, comparing us to the incidents of 1941's Japanese Pearl Harbor attack that launched World War II. This day, national security was quickly moved up all around the country. A terrorist directed two planes into the towers in the middle of the morning rush hour. There was no coincidence at the hour they did it. It was right at the height of the rush hour, right at 9 o'clock. And you say, well, how did this happen? Well, we don't know, but apparent two planes bound from Boston to Los Angeles were hijacked almost simultaneously. Somebody had to go into the cockpit of the plane, somebody had to command the plane, and somebody said, in effect, I'm a suicide bomber, an airborne suicide bomber. And they crashed the planes into the World Trade Center. And much the same thing is believed to have happened with the crash into the Pentagon. Now, as for what happened in western Pennsylvania in the Pittsburgh area with the plane crash, the details are sketchy. And yes, we did report that the FBI believed that there had been a plane crashed at or near the Camp David presidential retreat in Maryland. But that has remained a vague, unconfirmed story throughout the day. Debris coming down from the upper stories of the World Trade Center before those World Trade Center towers collapsed. some of the World Trade Center's 50,000 workers were seen leaping from windows to their certain death. That included, in one case, according to eyewitnesses, that included a man and a woman holding hands as they leaped from the World Trade Center, as the flames engulfed their floors. Some people jumped from as high as the 80th floor. This happened as the planes exploded into fireballs. Unimaginable, these things, but part of today's reality. Now, first reports had at least 600 people undergoing treatment at hospitals. Early reports said 150 of those were in critical condition. At least another 1,500 so-called walking wounded were taken to Liberty State, New Jersey for treatment. The mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, says it may take 2 days before a final figure of the dead and injured becomes known. No one would be surprised if it didn't take longer than 2 days. Yes, there was a New York mayoral primary vote scheduled today in New York that was canceled. I don't have to repeat, but will, that the financial markets closed immediately. They'll have a conference call tonight to determine whether financial markets will open tomorrow. Hospital officials have been preparing for the worst all day, and they've gotten the worst. The Bellevue Hospital medical director, Eric Mannheimer, called this, and I quote him, a catastrophe of unparalleled proportions. Now, speculation, and please mark the word, italicize the word speculation about the attack, rather quickly focused on terrorist fugitive Osama bin Laden, who was reported in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's Taliban government, the radical fundamentalist Islamic government of Afghanistan, moved quickly in a public relations effort, understandable from their point of view, to say two things. One, that they deplored this. Two, they had nothing to do with it. And three, this would surprise some people. That's what they said. And again, we want to come back to nothing but speculation so far. And we pointed out before, and we will point out again, that there are high-level intelligence people in this country and around the world who believe the United States have made a mistake by always attributing almost every terrorist act to Osama bin Laden. Who have thought that says we've built him up much larger than he is. I'm not subscribing or not subscribing to that point of view, simply pointing out that there is a point of view, a belief that... But it's way too early to make any conclusions about that. It's just simply to note that speculation centers around Osama bin Laden, as it has in almost every other case of terrorism over the last 8 years. Although it's true that a lot of people in the United States never heard of Osama bin Laden before the explosions at the U.S. embassies in Eastern Africa in 1998 and the ensuing directed targets in Sudan and Afghanistan. Before that, Osama bin Laden, he was known in intelligence circles and certainly known in the Middle East and around Afghanistan, but was not all that well known in the United States. A high-ranking federal law enforcement official has told our Washington Bureau that no one has been ruled out, but our initial feeling is that this is the work of bin Laden. That government official spoke only on the condition of anonymity. Chris Yates, a well-known aviation expert at Jane's in London, said, and I quote, only a small handful of terror groups could have pulled off this operation. And he says, and I quote him, I would name at the top of the list Osama bin Laden. In Afghanistan, a spokesman for the Taliban rulers denied that bin Laden had any role. However, a London-based Arab newspaperman said that followers of bin Laden warned 3 weeks ago that they would carry out what he called, and I quote him, a huge and unprecedented attack on U.S. interests. For whatever that may or may not be worth. President Bush ordered a full investigation to what he called hunt down the folks who committed this act. That's a direct quote. Now, American Airlines initially said the Trade Center was hit by 2 of its planes, both hijacked, carrying a total of 156 people, but the airline later said that that was unconfirmed, and now we believe that one American Airlines plane hit one of the World Trade Centers, and then a United Airlines plane hit the other World Trade Center, is what the current belief is. Now, CBS News correspondent and 60 Minutes 2 correspondent Carol Marin is downtown and has a report. Karen? Carol?
As I'm making my way toward the Trade Center along the water line, thousands of people were walking towards me, streaming out, almost not talking, trying to get through on cell phones that didn't work. Some of them crying, all of them looking pretty agonized. All of a sudden I heard a roar and I saw one of the towers blow and then collapse and fill the horizon with smoke, and I yelled, "Oh my God." And I saw from street level, as though it had exploded up, a giant rolling ball of flame, and the firefighters screamed, "Run." And I turned to run, but I fell, and I felt someone scoop me up, tell me to throw my high heels off, and I was running in my stocking feet with him. And finally, as we ran and ran, he slammed me into a wall and covered my body with his. I could feel his heart beating against my backbone. And I think both of us were sure we were dead, because there was no way you could run fast enough and there was no way to avoid it. But somehow we escaped the flame, which was immediately followed by a storm of debris. We were breathing, it felt like giant particles of plaster, and there was smoke, so that if you tried to put your hand out in front of you, you couldn't really see it. It was the thickest, most intense particle and smoke I've ever been in. And somewhere along the line, the firefighter handed me off to a New York police officer. The thing that struck me, though, was that I didn't see many wounded people in the street, which led me to believe, at least where I was by the Trade Center, they had never even gotten out of the building. I thought I was going to die. It is as close as I've ever come, a reporter, to thinking I was going to die.
Carol Marin, who was downtown earlier this morning when this catastrophe hit. I mistakenly said she was down now, which is what I thought, that this was a replay of a videotape interview we did with Carol Marin earlier in the day. Now, it's impossible not to compare this coordinated air attack, this undeclared act of war, with the attack on Pearl Harbor almost 60 years ago, the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And it's just as clear as can be that December 7th, 1941 will be forever remembered as, in President Franklin Roosevelt's phrase, a day of infamy. But so too will now September 11th, 2001, go down in history as a day of infamy. At this moment, you may want to recall that Pearl Harbor was a disaster that brought the United States of America together and propelled it to victory. A thought to ponder as we go through this afternoon. Now, around the world, there have been some expressions of solidarity with the United States. Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, made an eloquent short talk to that effect earlier in the day. Others among the United States allies in the world of freedom and democracy around the world
have expressed
similar sentiments. There have been some expressions of celebration. Palestinians on the West Bank were said to shoot their weapons in the air today, what was said to be a celebration. Now, what we're waiting on right now is a briefing at the U.S. Defense Department. A Pentagon briefing is expected to brief shortly, and as mentioned earlier, a senior official of the FBI is also expected to brief very shortly. Admiral Craig Quigley will be briefing at the Pentagon. Now, if you're saying to yourself, well, where is President Bush? The answer is we don't absolutely know. Last reported to be at the air base in Nebraska, getting a briefing. He had gone there from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana outside Shreveport. He had gone there from being in Florida earlier in the morning. And as we await the beginning of one of these briefings, you're looking at scenes. This is a live picture in Manhattan. Perhaps, I think the world's best-known skyline with the Empire State Building off to the mid-left in your screen with that high, looks like a stick, little known, that was supposed to be a dirigible landing place high atop the Empire State Building. That's what it was designed to be, but no dirigible was ever able to get in there. And in that place, the Empire State Building, one of the landmarks of our country, recognizable all over the world, this is what the skyline, the New York skyline, looks like today. The World Trade Center's gone, both of them. Yes, devastatingly gone, right to the ground. Both of them crumbled, each after having been hit separately by hijacked American airliners. And we may be able to show you what the New York City skyline looked like before today. You can imagine, as you've seen the postcard pictures, if not all of your life, for a long, long time. But both the World Trade Center buildings, which had become, they really had replaced the Empire State Building as the principal landmark of New York City, both of them are gone. The former foreign minister of Israel, Shimon Peres, is in Jerusalem. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Minister. I appreciate very much you doing this. Do you think this terrorist attack on the United States is because of its close friendship with Israel?
An attack on the United States, attack civilization and bring all of us back to the jungle. And I think we have to do whatever we can not to permit another war with terrible consequences to be spread over. May I say that each of us feel today like an American. Our heart is with the families, with the victims. It's full of pain. But we know the United States is a great and a strong country, and as you've won so many wars and suffered so many agonies, again, you and us and all of us will emerge stronger and more whole. I want to say that we have to draw consequences, all of us. We have had, or we are having armies against enemies that practically do not exist, but we have dangers without strategies and without armies. The most important consequence today is to develop a strategy against terror. It can happen every place, everywhere, and cause untold of damage and victims and blood and tears. And the time came for all of us to get ourselves organized. By the way, we send our own rescue team, which is already on the way to the United States. We shall do whatever we can to stand on the United States, which is leading the world, defending democracy, and enabling all of us to remain as a civilized community.
Ron Paris, you know our country, my country, well. And you know that there are any number of people in the United States who believe these bombings today are a direct result of U.S. support for Israel over the years in the Middle East. To those people who say that, what say you?
Well, you know, there were other acts of terror that has nothing to do with Israel, including in the United States itself. Terror is a terrible way of destruction and killing. And you have all over the world acts of terror that has nothing to do with Israel. Terror
Mr. Paris,
is a
if you'll
new
excuse
phenomenon.
me a moment, I know that you will understand this. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but Karen Hughes, the principal assistant to President Bush, has begun to brief, and we'll pick her up in progress.
Evacuated for security reasons and to protect our workers. Your federal government continues to function effectively. We have a federal emergency response plan, and at President Bush's direction, we are implementing it. We began to implement it immediately after the first attack in New York this morning. We contacted American forces and embassies throughout the world and placed them on high alert. The United States Secret Service immediately secured the President, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House, and they are all safe. They have also secured members of the National Security Team, the President's Cabinet, and senior staff. As you know, President Bush was in Sarasota, Florida, when the first attack occurred this morning. Air Force One has now landed at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, and the President is in a secure location. He is in continuous communication with the Vice President and key members of his cabinet and national security team. Vice President Cheney and our National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, are in a secure facility at the White House. I have just come from there. The Secretary of Transportation and other members of our White House staff are gathered at a command center there, and we are coordinating with other branches of our federal government. The Secretary of Defense remains at the Pentagon, and the Secretary of State is en route back to Washington from his trip to South America. President Bush is conducting a meeting of the National Security Council as we speak. They are meeting President Bush from his location and other members from different locations in Washington and other locations. As many of you have been reporting, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all airports closed, and all planes which were in the air were directed to land at the nearest airport. International flights were diverted to alternate locations outside of the United States. Transportation Secretary Mineta has directed the Federal Aviation Administration to suspend operations until at least noon tomorrow. So no airline flights will operate until at least then, and until the FAA announces that operations will be resumed. Secretary Mineta has also issued orders controlling the movement of all vessels in United States navigable waters. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has activated 8 urban search and rescue task forces in New York, and 4 of these highly trained teams are at work here in Washington at the Pentagon. Every federal agency has implemented continuity of operations plans to make sure the government continues to function effectively. While the markets closed today because of the situation in Manhattan, the United States financial system has continued to operate. Banks have been open all day. The Federal Reserve has operated regularly and continuously. The Department of Health and Human Services has mobilized medical personnel and supplies to provide help to local authorities who are working so diligently to respond and try to help the victims of these terrible attacks. President Bush has committed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to identify and bring to swift justice those responsible for these despicable attacks. The Department of Justice is setting up a hotline for families who fear that their relatives may have been victims of one of these attacks, and we will be announcing that telephone number shortly. Our fellow citizens and our freedom came under attack today. No one should doubt America's resolve. President Bush and all our country's leaders thank the many Americans who are helping with rescue and relief efforts. We ask our fellow Americans for your prayers for the victims, for their families, for the rescue workers, and for our country. Thank you all very much, and we will continue to update you as information is available and confirmed.
Karen Hughes, people believe, is one of the 2 most influential advisors around President Bush, briefing at FBI headquarters in Washington. Karl Rove, another Texan, transplanted Texan, but Texan being the other widely believed second most important person around President Bush. Karl Rove is believed to be with President Bush. The president was last reported at the Air Force Base in Nebraska, being debriefed there after going first to an Air Force Base outside Shreveport, Louisiana, where he made a videotape short talk to the nation. He'd gone there from Florida. The president said in Florida he was going back to Washington. He did not do that. The official reason being that the Secret Service, among others, thought that they, under the circumstances, it would not be the most advisable thing for the president to go back to Washington. But if you look at the map, at least mentally, the president's gone from Florida to Shreveport, Louisiana, to the air base, Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Where he goes next is anybody's guess. But Karen Hughes just briefed.
John Chester,
the spokesman at the Pentagon, has a briefing underway there. Let's go to it live.
right. The military, the service secretary...
Well, we're obviously having some audio difficulties there at the Pentagon. We'll bring you up to date on what they said there. What we know about the Pentagon already is that an apparent hijacked aircraft, a commercial airliner, was crashed into the Pentagon, and actually into, we're told, a helipad right next to the Pentagon. There was damage to the Pentagon itself. Flames and smoke consumed a portion of the Pentagon for a while. Mark well, since the Pentagon opened in 1943, this is the first time it's actually come under a direct attack. Nothing even approaching this has ever happened at the Pentagon before. After a long delay, the Defense Department confirmed that there had been fatalities. How many, we do not know, at the Pentagon. And we saw some treated and then carried away earlier in the day. But we don't have a lot of information on what happened at the Pentagon just yet. Now, I'm told that we now have some audio before you go to the Defense Department. Pick up on the briefing. John Chester. Well, two strikes on that. We obviously don't have the audio of Mr. John Jester. I'm sorry, that mistake is mine, for which I apologize, but Mr. John Chester, we couldn't pick up the audio. This is one of those days when obviously we're doing the best we can to bring you as many live reports as we can. We had talked to Shimon Peres in Israel just before we went to Karen Hughes. And he was pointing out, this is a paraphrase of what he was saying, that yes, the United States has stood with Israel all of these years, but that under these circumstances, the Israelis certainly understood, perhaps better than some, the enormity of what was happening this day. And we do apologize for having to interrupt that interview in progress, but of course we did so to go to the Karen Hughes briefing. Now, we're coming up to nearly the hour mark, and as the hour mark passes, we'll bring you up to date on all of the facts and details as we have them. But in the meantime, let's go back to Washington and our chief Washington correspondent, Bob Schieffer. Bob?
Well, Dan, I am here with Senator Chuck, who's a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. He has been to a series of briefings. Let me ask you quickly, Senator, because we're pressed for time, we're going to come back. Is the talk now about reopening the Capitol tomorrow?
Yes.
And why would that be?
Well, the security, we believe, is clear, will be clear by tomorrow, and we don't want to shut down our government and our country. The terrorists win here. As long as we're secure in our nation and our structure and our ship, then I think we should move on, and we intend to do that tomorrow.
And Dan, Senator Hagel, of course, is a senator from Nebraska, Offutt Air Force Base, the former home of the Strategic Air Command, is where the president is. When we come back, we can talk to Senator Hagel about why the president went there. Okay.
Bob Schieffer in Washington. Bob, on the roof of a building in the far distance, you could still see some of the smoke from the Pentagon. The fire has subsided in the Pentagon, having been put out. The smoke may go on for a number of hours, perhaps even days, depending on how much damage. We don't really know how much damage there was done to the Pentagon. Understandably, the Pentagon is not giving out a lot of information about what the situation is there, it, after all, being the military heart of U.S. defenses. Now, here in New York, I want to show you what it looks like in Lower Manhattan at the moment. This is now, 7 hours after the first aircraft, hijacked commercial airliner, hit the first of the Twin Towers. Great smoke still. There's been snow, water, and on the land for these 7 hours. And this smoke does not show any signs of going away anytime soon. Rescue crews on the ground, this shot taken from up high. Rescue crews on the ground frantically trying to do several things. One, attend to the wounded, some of whom are seen, and two, put out the fires, and then try to search for people still believed to be alive in the rubble and ruin of the World Trade Center. They're organizing efforts to find those people. Some fire and police casualties have been reported. The full extent we do not know. There have been no fatalities reported among fire and police, but make no mistake, there have been at least wounded among the fire and police health. You are watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Dan Rather at CBS News World Headquarters in New York, where the twin towers of the World Trade Center have been hit each individually by a hijacked airliner, 4 hijacked commercial airliners that we know of today. This is an actual photograph of one of the planes flying to one of the towers earlier this morning. The plane goes deep in to the tower. Flame spits out the opposite side, followed by these incredible scenes. One of the towers begins to collapse. It looks for a few faint moments like maybe it will just be partially collapsing the tower. But then quickly the realization, it's all going. Down it went. And then the second tower, fire and smoke belching out of it. No one believed that it could happen, would happen, but then, again, incredibly, down it came. As we said at the time, it looked like a scene from the end of the world. It was the end of the World Trade Center. The most famous skyline in the world, changed in a matter of minutes by horrendous acts of terrorism. In the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, a direct attack on the freedom of every American, and indeed on the freedom of anyone who has it around the world. It is not too much to say that. Scott Pelley, CBS News correspondent, is downtown near where the World Trade Center used to be. Scott?
Dan, I have journeyed into the downtown area very near the World Trade Center building itself. I was maybe 60 yards away, and we were able to see the World Trade Center building, what was left of it. I can only describe it to you, Dan, as about 15 stories tall, with a broken top, completely shot through, a burning hulk. All around it in that neighborhood, the buildings burning. The smoke that you see behind me is coming primarily from a 50 or 60-story tall building that was about half a block from the World Trade Center. That building is deeply involved in flame. There is flame shooting out of the windows. When we were below it just about 30 minutes ago, big panes of glass were popping out of the building and crashing below. Rescue workers really can't get into that area right now because it's much too dangerous. In the streets around the World Trade Center, Manhattan traffic stopped and was incinerated right where it stood. We saw a number of New York City police cars, obviously some of the first responders to the scene. The police cars were blown to pieces and completely burned. Some U.S. postal vehicles were actually melted onto the street just a few yards from the World Center itself. I spoke to some firemen, Dan, from the Bronx, who were some of the first responders in, and they told us that after the first tower,
try to save some
people in the area around the second tower. And then the second tower began to come down. And these men looked over their shoulders and found an entrance to a subway.
Drive down the stairs into the
subway as the Trade Center tower came down around them. They told us that a police lieutenant was trying to warn them away at the time that the building was coming down. He had his arms high in the air, trying to get them to run. And they said that that lieutenant was hit by falling debris and, as best they could tell, was severely wounded. We talked to a number of firefighters and paramedics who have been at the center of this hell and have come out covered in soot and dust and have told us amazing stories of heroism. One fireman told us that when the second tower came down, they were completely covered in black smoke and swirling dust, and the firefighters held each other's hands in kind of a human chain in order to get out of that area. Another firefighter, actually a retired firefighter who ran to the scene as soon as what was happening, came out and told us that he didn't see any wounded people around the World Trade Centers. He just saw what he described as parts of bodies. I tried to get him to tell me how many he thought he saw in terms of the number of people killed, and he said it's much, much too many to be counted. Dan?
Scott Pelley in Lower Manhattan. Thomas Paine, 1894, quote, "These are the times that try men's souls, and so is time that try men's souls. Also, there are times that test the mettle, that test the very character of a nation. Each generation, in one way or the other, faces some kind of maximum test. Who is to say that this is not ours?" Timeline: plane crashes into tower of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan shortly before 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Just after 9 a.m., second plane crashes into the second tower of the World Trade Center. It's believed that a American Flight 11 Boston Los Angeles, a Boeing 767 with 81 passengers and 11 crew, was the first of the two planes that struck the world.
Worst terrorist attack in history. First, terrorists crashed two airliners into the World Trade Center buildings in New York. Thousands could be dead.
We really don't know. Officials
rushed to evacuate
the buildings, and then an even
more gruesome sight. Both skyscrapers come down in a thunderous roar.
As the planes rammed the Trade Center, people were left literally holding on for life. This video taken just moments after the attack. Workers hung to the remains of the shattered glass and steel building. Some were unable to hang on long enough until help arrived and fell from the destroyed towers. And at any given time, the numbers of people working in the Trade Center towers is 50,000. New York's mayor says it could take several days, maybe even weeks, to determine the number of those killed.
Good afternoon, everyone. We have the latest information coming in right now from New York City and also from
Washington, D.C. Officers are still patrolling right now, and the Capitol is under a state of emergency, all because of the third attack this morning. Another hijacked plane crashed into the Pentagon, blasting part of the building and setting it on fire. At least 35 people are hurt, some severely, but so far no word on any fatalities. And when the planes crashed and explosions started happening, the world just seemed to stop.
It sure did. People here in Cleveland stopped what they were doing to watch the graphic and frightening image. As word of the attack spread, people in downtown Cleveland went anywhere they could for any information. People stopped in their tracks in downtown, watching on jumbotrons at Playhouse Square. Many others stopped to peer through the windows at Home Team 19 and Home Team 43 to watch.
Then they had a hard time
comprehending the devastation that they were watching.
We're at a conference.
In
New York. I live about a mile away from the Pentagon, so
It's just such a catastrophic amount of damage and amount of loss of life, and just the human factor here just can't possibly be measured. And I just pray for all the families that are involved.
it's very upsetting.
After the first car went to the second.
Did you have any? News of the horrific devastation in New York City led to quick decisions by dozens of businesses in downtown Cleveland right here, especially those in high-rise buildings. They shut down for the entire day.
And our Paul Olowski was with commuters as they headed out of town. Paul?
Well, Cynthia, one of the first buildings that was evacuated, and evacuated quite quickly, was the federal
building behind me.
Obviously, federal buildings could be targets. It's really very simple. This is an older design building, and as you see behind me, you can pull right up to that building, as was done in Oklahoma City. The Mura building, a truck filled with explosives. Newer buildings, the FBI building they're building downtown, and the new federal courthouse are built set back away from the road. But really the story is off to the left. 9th and Lakeside, normally one of the busiest at this time of day, is deserted. The late morning was one of the most odd I've ever seen. For a time, horns were honking.
People become frustrated with gridlock, but
within an hour or so, the streets were deserted, as you see. Police tried their best to direct the morning rush hour that was the opposite of the norm, an exodus from the city. Quickly, buses filled as businesses closed. dozens of them. Guards took up positions on all four corners surrounding the federal courthouse. It was closed. On Playhouse Square, commuters watched giant screens in disbelief as the word spread like wildfire.
We got an email, and it went from there, and then people started turning on radios, and it just got worse and worse and worse.
People you work with know people who work in New York, work in the World Trade Center?
Yeah, I think everybody knew somebody or had a friend or relative who knew somebody.
The exodus out of town was best understood here on Euclid Avenue at Public Square. The streets and the sidewalks virtually deserted at what normally would be a very busy lunch hour. Most leaving town had a hard time believing the day's events, but are unsure on what can be done to prevent a repeat.
We get into a complacency.
Are you surprised that the government didn't have some knowledge that this was coming, given that obviously it was very well planned?
Not really. It's a terrorist attack. It is a surprise attack. It would be nice to know exactly who it was.
It's inevitable.
Yeah.
There's no stopping what happened today. There's no prevention methods that could have been in place to stop an attack.
They've taken some methods here. As you see, several police cars guarding Cleveland City Hall. The flags have now been lowered to half staff here at Cleveland City Hall, which is just off to my right as the afternoon goes on. I stopped on the way over. As I walked over, just poked my head into St. John Cathedral. A lot of people inside not talking about the event, having just a moment of silence. A lot of people lighting votive candles, just reflecting on the damage that's been done. One of the things that we saw as much as anything, people on cell phones as they left the downtown area trying to make some contact to make sure anyone that they might know in New York was okay. And when you really think about it, if the numbers that are possible of people that were injured or killed in this, Jack and Cynthia, it really is very, very likely that almost all of us will know someone. The numbers could be into the thousands, possibly worse, tens of thousands.
And it seems like, as you said, Paul, all of us will be touched in some way by this tragedy, and you can't help but have an overwhelming feeling of helplessness.
Well, what can you do? And I think maybe that's why people were turning to the cathedral. I don't think they know what to do or how they could help, but just a moment of silence.
And Paul, I think you picked up
And shocked at what happened.
But there's anger out there. There's we want justice. We want a reason for this happening, and I think there is a definite anger among millions of Americans right now in the country.
Well, one of the things we heard, and maybe it's not America at its best, but was people wanting revenge, not wanting another trial as in the World Trade Center bombing case from several years back, 1993, I believe. People wanted revenge. They're looking for a strike, some way to vent that frustration, I suppose. Probably not their best emotion, but it's what we're picking up on the streets.
Okay, Paul, you stay downtown in case anything breaks. We'll get back to you momentarily if it does.
All right.
In the meantime, the evacuations choked up streets as workers to leave the downtown area.
Most major cab companies continued to operate while 2 RTA train lines were shut down in Tower City and the airport because of the shutdown at Hopkins International. RTA buses began running on a more frequent schedule than usual to accommodate the early rush hour, making rounds every 15 minutes or so. And Lake Tran, which serves Lake County, though, is running on schedule. Home Team News anchor Denise Afalo is now on her way to New York City.
She's live right now to join us with the very latest. And Denise, we understand
It's going to be tough once you get closer
to New York, but you had a hard time actually getting out of the greater Cleveland area.
Yes, we did, Jack. And in fact, once we got to the Turnpike, we noticed it's virtually a ghost town like it is in downtown Cleveland. Practically the only vehicles we're seeing on the roads are the big rigs, the 18-wheelers. Not very many cars out here traveling today, as if everyone is by the news and staying home to watch the coverage and to find out what's happening. Another thing is the cell phone calls that Olowski mentioned. We have been calling friends and contacts in New York the entire way. Nothing. No calls are going in or out of New York City at this time. It is absolute chaos. You can't dial in. We're in eastern Pennsylvania now. We are on 80 East, and we're going to get to as close as New York City as possible, and we're going to bring you first counts just as soon as we get them.
All right, Denise, and we'll be checking in with you as you head to New York, of course, coming up tonight at 10, and of course on Home Team 19 News at 11.
You watching at home that in case anything breaks on a national level, we will leave you immediately, go back to CNN, go back to CBS News, Dan Rather, to bring you the very latest updates on a national scale. So please don't think that we're preventing you from seeing any updates nationally, either in New York, Washington, D.C. If there is anything of an urgent need, we will leave you and go back to the network. So please stay with us if that does happen.
is also shut down at this hour,
Just like airports all across the country.
And that's one reason why Denise is headed by car to New York. They were evacuated. Several planes were because of making an emergency landing. A Delta Airlines Boeing 7
emergency landing at
Hopkins today because of concerns that there may be a bomb on board. The plane was moved to a
secure location where FBI agents
searched the aircraft. They found the package in question. As it turns out, it was a lamp, and everybody on board was evacuated. However, air traffic controllers say that they could hear screaming coming from inside the plane, which took off from Boston this morning. Right now, the airport is closed, and at this time, there is no word on when it will reopen. But we understand from the FAA that all American flights
will be halted until
noon tomorrow.
At the earliest, the skies will be clear of any commercial flights at least until noon tomorrow. Well, the Cleveland area is definitely high on alert right now because of the plane.
And the home team's Bill Youngkin joins us now live from Hopkins with more.
Well, with all the tragedy that's taken place today, I can tell you local FBI
agents were taking no
chances out here at Hopkins International Airport today. At about 9:45, about an hour after the first hijacked jet slammed into the World Trade Tower, the FAA informed the FBI here that Delta Flight 1989 with 69 people on board would be grounded here in Cleveland. For over 2 hours, it would sit on the tarmac in the secure area of the airport. There were rumors it might be carrying a hijacked plane or was carrying a bomb. Even the mayor said that it could have a suspected bomb on board, but both were false.
What we've learned is that because of the crash into the World Trade and the similar flight path for Delta Flight 1989 that arrived here in Cleveland, Delta Airlines grounded their plane. I just want to make it very clear that investigation is ongoing, but at this time, there does not appear that there was a hijack or any apparent act of terrorism relating to Delta Flight 1989.
I talked with some construction workers who were out on the runway when FBI agents came out and told them to get out of here right away, along with some people from the National Weather Service.
The airport was more like bunker.
And the FBI took over during the watching of that plane that went on for a couple of hours. We'll hear from some of those employees a little bit later. But inside the airport, it was organized chaos. As the airport was shut down, people were walking on place, they were walking on the freeway. It was a scene of mass confusion. And our Harry Boomer was there with them. Harry, I've never seen anything like it.
Bill, this is definitely a story in a very negative kind of way. A lot of people will be upset and hurt about what has happened all over the country. Those 4 hijacked planes may have gone down in New York City and Washington, D.C., and 2 other targets, but their impacts are being felt all over the country, including here in Cleveland. Hopkins International Airport is on lockdown, and body was evacuated.
They told us to get out of the concourse and made it.
Thousands of air travelers had their flights
disrupted following the unthinkable attack on America. Disbelief.
God. All I can think of is the people. The poor people. And why?
Every airport around the country, including Hopkins International, was shut down. Every flight was canceled as air traffic came to a halt.
I'm okay.
Cell phone use markedly increased as folks phoned home trying to contact loved ones.
I'm fine. I'm in Cleveland, and I'm landed safe. They got us evacuated out of the airport, but we're all in one piece. I need you to inform the site, and I really need you to get a hold of Joey, because she knows I was going to New York. She doesn't know. I haven't been able to contact her yet.
You know, I don't care about myself. It's just a horrible tragedy. As far as those people in New York and Washington, it's awful.
It didn't take long for authorities at the airport to divert vehicle traffic.
Go in front of their car.
Thousands of stranded passengers.
On foot. Even as the terrorist attacks continued around the country, the Clevelanders reacted angrily.
I feel like this is a nightmare.
If this is the case that it's terrorists, it's about time the United States quit being nice to all these countries and worrying about etiquette and go after these idiots.
Basically, terrorists have done what they wanted to do. They've disrupted all of America. It's a tragic, tragic day.
A range of emotions here at Hopkins today as people learn the details of the tragic bombings all over this country. Just a personal side note, many of you may know that I'm from Washington, D.C. I have family there. Daughter is safe in in Washington, D.C., but her uncle, who works at the Pentagon, has not been heard from yet. I've made several personal phone calls. I can't get through. The lines are very, very busy. And as you know, that's what's happening all over the country. And Hopkins will be closed down at least until noon tomorrow. Of course, we're going to be on top of it and bring you the very latest. Back to you in the studio.
Harry, I can imagine your thoughts and concerns.
Personally worried about your daughter, but she didn't know anything about all this when it unfolded?
Well, actually, she was okay. She lives in southeast Washington, D.C., nowhere near the Pentagon and her mother and all of that. But her uncle, they're most concerned about him right now. They've heard nothing, and it has been hours.
Harry, one of the most riveting pieces of tape we've seen today outside of what happened in New York and Washington is the interview you had with the gentleman who's on the phone reassuring his family that he's okay and call so-and-so to make sure that they know that he's in Cleveland. There's a lot of us that need to be reassured that we are okay, and as a nation, hopefully this thing is going to be nipped in the bud, so to speak. But that interview that you had with that gentleman was just very emotional.
You know, he walked over to me, Jack. He says, "Sir, you look like a man who..." I reached and gave him my phone, and he called Jody. I don't know if she's his wife, his girlfriend, or whomever, but it is someone that he's very close to. He was able to get in contact with his office. They, in turn, got in contact with his family to let them know that he was okay.
All the people who had to leave the airport, Harry, where did they go? Did they just walk to nearby hotels, or what were their plans?
Just about any place they could get to. Many tried to get to hotels. Some cabs tried to get in. The police were not letting anybody in there. They told people, you're going to have to walk to the roadway, call your family. They can pull over to the side and come get you, but they cannot come near the airport. And folks just walked over nearest a hotel. Some caught the shuttles into downtown Cleveland. Any place they could get that could... They found themselves just trying to, like everybody else, glued to the TV sets to find out what's happening.
Okay, Harry Boomer reporting live from Cleveland Hopkins Airport. Thank you for the update. And Harry, if anything new happens out there, of course, we will go back to you and Bill for any kind of updates. In the meantime, as you probably have already heard, there were 4 planes in all hijacked earlier today.
Here now is the latest information on those flights. American Airlines Flight 11 had just taken off from Boston's Logan International Airport and was headed to Los Angeles when it crashed into the World Trade Center this morning. 81 passengers were on board, including 9 flight attendants and 2 pilots. American Airlines Flight 77 was also
in Washington, D.C.
58 passengers were on board. United Airlines Flight 93 crashed southeast of Pittsburgh while
New Jersey. The aircraft was headed to San
Francisco, and in all, 45 people were on board. United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. The plane had just left Boston and was headed to
Los Angeles.
56 passengers were on that particular plane.
The home team's Bill Sappho. The home team news, and he is standing by live right now outside of City Hall with the latest information from there. Bill?
Absolutely, Jack. We are waiting right now for Mayor Mike White to come forward in the Red Room of City Hall with a press conference at 4:30. But in the meantime, as you can imagine, mayors of major cities across the United States assessing their own situation. We were also in Akron earlier talking with Mayor.
People need to be calm. We do not have any reason to believe that there is any threat at this time to any facility or anyone in Summit County.
But further down I-77 at the Akron-Canton Airport, emergency measures there, too, were put in place by the Federal Aviation Administration. They were to expect as many as 60 planes to come down at that small regional airport. 6 ended up coming, including this American Airlines 757, which was en route to Boston.
And we knew we were going to have diversions. We thought as many as 60. Turned out only to be 6, but we had some stranded passengers that we've been carrying in the terminal.
And Fred Crum, the director of the Akron-Canton Airport, said they have been taking care of all the passengers, putting a lot of those passengers on buses to neighboring cities. A lot of folks going to Pittsburgh, some to Detroit, others here to Cleveland, but still many, those en route to that Boston Logan Airport, still stranded at this point at Akron-Canton's Regional Airport. Obviously, a lot of concern with that Boston Logan flight. It is a plane that goes back and forth from Boston Logan to other parts of the country. It was headed back there. They were very concerned about it. Obviously, you can imagine a lot of security at that airport as well. Getting back to Mayor Plasqualik and the things he talked about, he does say that one of the area high schools, Hoban High School, did have a bomb threat, and they went and checked it out. It turned out to be but nevertheless a threat they took very seriously. A few other rumors, he said, around town about threats, but none that substantiated to anything important. Obviously, a lot of buildings shut down there, too. Looks very much like downtown Cleveland, a ghost town. It absolutely
Okay, Bill, thank you. We're going to have to break away right now, but thank you for the update. Well, police got a horrifying call from on board the United Airlines plane that crashed about 80 miles south of Pittsburgh. Again, the crash killed everyone aboard, 45 people in all.
And the home team's Ed Gallagher is now via telephone from a rural community. It's called Jennerstown, where that crash took place. Ed?
That's right. I just got on a bus and came right up to the crash site. They're bringing media members up, and I can tell you that if you didn't know there was a plane crash today and you didn't see the evidence there, you would call this heaven. We're talking about rolling fields. We're talking about farmhouses, trees, very rural. Instead, what we have now is an area that's roped off, state troopers everywhere, all kinds of emergency vehicles around. And then if you look over the area where the plane actually went down, which is where I'm standing, you still don't really know there was a plane crash, except that there is a huge indentation or a huge hole in the ground now where the plane apparently nosedived, and then it continued on into some trees. In fact, the plane disintegrated to such a great extent, we're told by the Highway Patrol here that there are no recognizable aircraft parts to be seen down there. So, if you look from where I'm standing on a bluff overlooking the field, you can see that something obviously went into the ground very hard, and then you can see scorched trees. As far as the rest of the area here, people are still talking about that 911 call.
They were locked in a bathroom saying this plane is being hijacked, this plane is being hijacked. Now, the FBI is investigating to see if, in fact,
that was legit, or what the origin of that call was, who made it, how they were able to do it. Those kinds of questions still unanswered. The investigators are treating this, though, as a crime scene. They believe that this plane, was hijacked. And there was a congressman from Virginia who was saying on the record that he was told by Marine Corps investigators that the plane was meant to crash into the president's retreat at Camp David in Maryland. So that is another avenue that is being explored. Again, no survivors on this plane. The only buildings nearby were a couple of hunting cabins. Fortunately, this is an area that once was strip mined, and so therefore there were no injuries on the ground as well. But that is the latest from the scene. Investigators are still just trying to find every shred of evidence, and we will be bringing you pictures of what I'm describing now. You will see these pictures coming up on Home Team 19 News at 6 o'clock. Back to you.
Okay, Ed, thank you for the update. We'll be back to Ed and find out more about that crash and also have
information on what we have been seeing
and hearing about all day long from New York City, from Washington, D.C., and also from Western Pennsylvania.
Let's go now to continuing coverage of CNN and CBS as our coverage on the attack in America continues.
No one can go in to get the people out. There's small explosions still going on.